Okay, just want to make sure that's you. Nobody's
We're not
hacking into the
recessed.
system. Right. All right. So sitting over there, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I want you to know, I'm gonna keep my promise and keep it short.
yes, thank you.
Facts, and very few of them. Of course, I'm talking about charity and the connection, so.
Perfect. Thank you.
But I'm also gonna say, I promise you, so that they're not like,
Right.
oh my God, he's totally dissing.
Right. Do you think I can leave my notes here?
Yeah.
Okay, that won't interfere with? All right.
Coke, you want water?
No, I'm good. The Coke's good for me.
Okay.
Testing, testing, loud and clear on your end.
Sounds good.
Perfect. All right, so this one, yep, this is the right spot. We're good. Clicker's working. Joseph, so I saw that you took down the slides. At what point will you bring them up? When I'm being introduced, is that when you're going to pull my slides up?
Yes, I can do it.
Okay. But you'll do it from there? Okay. Okay. All right, perfect.
Stacy was saying she wanted to have this up when people come in.
Right, exactly.
When everybody gets settled, I just.
You'll put it up. All right, perfect. Thank you. You rock. All right, and now we'll use this one. Charity Scott. Charity.
Yep.
About 2 minutes and just recognize
Yeah, that would be.
the other one. Okay.
We'll be starting late because it'll take a while for people to decide to,
Oh, really?
you know. Stacy's gonna talk about herd, but you know, it's herding cats.
You need that little chime, right?
Right, oh, yeah, yeah.
Ding, that always gets everybody, oh, wait, what?
Yeah,
Anyway, all right, I'll be
yes,
right back.
yep.
sure this is on. Test. Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Welcome to everyone. My name's Courtney Anderson, and I'm the interim dean here at the College of Law. And I definitely speak for all faculty and staff when I say that we're so excited to see all of the alumni, faculty, health law attorneys, healthcare practitioners, families and friends of the Center for Law, Health, and Society here to attend tonight's event, both online and in person. And tonight's event, of course, is the inaugural Charity Scott Endowed Lecture featuring Daniel Dawes. And this new lecture series is made possible by the generosity of the family of Charity Scott, our founding center director, who passed away nearly 2 years ago. Her vision launched the College of Law Health program in 2004, and it has grown exponentially since that time under her leadership to what it is today, which is the #1 health law program in the country. Yes, clap a little. And we're so excited to have Charity's family attending tonight as well. And so this lecture series really enables us to keep Charity spirit alive among our health law community. This series is a way for future lawyers to learn about the various health law topics that Charity was passionate about. And for many years, Charity invited our health law students, graduates, faculty, attorneys, and friends of the center all to her home to build the health law community that she envisioned. And through this endowed lecture series, we continue her tradition of coming together in community. I'm particularly honored to stand here because I'm a faculty member in the Center for Law, Health, and Society, and I was hired into an interdisciplinary research cluster focused on issues of health equity by Charity Scott and former dean, who's also here, Steve Kamenschein, about a decade ago. And I'm sure many of us in this room can speak on Charity's influence that she had on our scholarship, our advocacy, and interests. And so I'd like to share a quick story. One of the first emails I received from Charity was a reply to a draft course syllabus that I sent her for a new course I wanted to offer, Law and Health Equity. And so in the course, students are paired with a nonprofit to help mitigate a health disparity. And so on September 10th, 2013, Charity replied to my email sharing the draft syllabus of this class, just a few quick notes. And then she provided a 4-page email that included a list of 12 very substantive ideas. I'm only going to share points 8 and 9 with you tonight. Okay? So point number 8. At the end of the semester, I see you have a transition memo. Who decides if there's work that still needs to be done? Is this from the perspective of the community partner? If not, who will carry the ball? We certainly would not want to wait until next year for the next round of students in order to move these initiatives forward. And point 9, I see you have a lesson on community organizing. That will be fascinating. Are the students learning about it, or will they actually be doing it? So I share this to say that the level of humanity that Charity infused into the practice and study of health law is truly inspirational, and it was not optional if you worked with her, for her, or near her. And so I feel like this lecture series really gives us the opportunity to reflect on the importance of celebrating our differences and appreciating the perspectives of marginalized communities rather than ignoring and oppressing diversity. And we have so many intelligent and dedicated faculty and staff members who coordinated this really exciting lecture event. Marissa Daniels in faculty support, our IT, communications, and conference services teams, and Stacy Kirshner, who is the deputy director of the center. This title does not encompass all of the value she adds to this institution, but as the English language expands, so will her title. And finally, thanks are due to the director of our Center for Law, Health, and Society, Professor Leslie Wolf. Leslie is a leading expert in, among other things, bioethics, the protection of human subjects in research, and HIV/AIDS. This clearly illustrates Leslie's commitment to an expansive view of health equity and her belief in legal advocacy to achieve the same. So distinguished university professor and Ben F. Johnson Jr. Chair in Law, Leslie Wolf, will now introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Daniel E. Dawes. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And I'm going to take a moment before I introduce our speaker to add a few more words. I was also going to mention the fact that we brought a health equity scholar to Georgia State in 2012. I want to tell you, at the time that we did that, nobody knew what we were looking for. Nobody understood this, but then this housing lawyer came in who really got it. And it shows you how visionary Charity was. I was one of those people who I wouldn't be here except for Charity Scott, that I was looking to maybe go into a law school, growing up, as I always said, at a medical center where I lived on soft money. I thought, well, maybe a law school would be a good idea. I saw an ad in one of the journals that was looking for public health and for research ethics. As Courtney has just said, those are things that I do. But I did not pick up the phone until I saw the name Charity Scott. I got to know her, as many our colleagues, particularly online, through the Health Law Professors Conference, and made a closer relationship because I had tried to hire her son. And I think all of us who know Charity know how important her family is, as well as those relationships she liked to build. And we built a relationship when she would give me updates about Peter at every Health Law Professors Conference. So I picked up the phone, and the rest, they say, this is my 18th year, so the rest is history. So it is also fitting, as Dean Anderson has already indicated, that we are talking about health equity tonight. The Charity shared a long commitment and passion for this, reflected, and it was unusual to be thinking about law and how it can affect health at the time she was doing it. That recognition led her to partner with Sylvia Cayley, a nurse and a graduate of our law school, to create the Health Law Partnership in 2004. But that was the culmination of 13 years, Sylvia? 13 years of hard work to get somebody to understand what they were trying to do. And as we already said, we got a health equity lawyer well before anybody else was talking about it. So it is just so fitting that we have Daniel Dawes here today. Daniel is, and I always want to make sure I get the titles right, the Senior Vice President of Global Health and the founding dean of the School of Global Health at Meharry University Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. I promised him last night that I would not go long into his biography. If you want to look him up, you will see how truly impressive he is. But let me do share that before being at Meharry, he was here at Morehouse College, at Morehouse School of Medicine, where he was director of the Satcher Health Leadership Institute. And during that time, it was an opportunity for him to meet Charity. So Stacy and I had decided he was going to be the perfect inaugural speaker, and then he responded to the invitation so enthusiastically and commented on the relationship to Charity, and we thought it was sort of ordained. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Dawes to.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. I was expecting a warm Atlanta welcome. It is so wonderful to be here tonight, and I want to thank you, Dr. Wolf, for the very kind introduction, and to all of you, Dean Anderson, to all of you for the invitation to speak tonight. You know, as you heard, I'm really honored to serve as the inaugural speaker, and more so because of who this lecture is named after. You know, Charity Scott was someone way before I got here to Atlanta that I got to know, because as a law student, I was actually in my first year, and I approached the dean and I said, you know, Dean Wilborn, I would like to concentrate in health law. And at that point, it was really a fledgling area of law. They didn't know what it was. And so he says, well, what do you want to do? We don't have any health law courses. You know, we have one faculty coming in who is an expert on ERISA law. You can maybe pull in arbitration law. And I said, okay, just give me a moment. Let me go do some due diligence here. Let me dig. And I went online, and would you believe, came across what Charity Scott was doing here at the law college. And from there, I said, Dean Wilborn, look what they're doing. Here's what they've been doing. And actually, through my research, I also found a cohort of other scholars who were focused on health law through the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. And I thought, yes, now we're on to something. So Charity actually had a great influence on my life, the trajectory of my life and my career in health law and in health equity. So we are very much aligned in that case. And I really salute her because she has been not only a national treasure, but a bright light from which many of us have been lit. I know many of us in this audience, many watching online, and across the nation and world, we really do owe a debt of gratitude to that trailblazing professor that was eager to disrupt the academy and ensure that we could have this fledgling field of health equity and health law. And I thought it very fitting, you know, as I was preparing tonight, as I was thinking about what should the title be. And I know Professor Wolf was on me. What is your title? What are your your objectives? And I said, oh, I haven't been inspired yet. I need to give it a little more thought. And of course, the elections happen. We get a result that I thought, this is interesting. What does this mean for the movement to advance health equity? You know, in our country, there's long been this overarching movement to advance healthcare access, coverage, and so forth. But underlying that movement has been another one, which Charity and others in this room have been a part of, to stretch that umbrella of inclusion, right? To ensure that people who have been invisible in our society, that have been locked out and blocked out of opportunities in terms of healthcare access, would be able to achieve such. And so in thinking about this time, I went back to the old poems, right? The old greats. And I landed on James Weldon Johnson, where he wrote the poem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And it's what's been carrying me through the last several weeks as I think about what this means for our movement in terms of political determinants of health. He wrote, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who has brought us thus far on the way, thou who has by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. So, tonight I have titled this lecture, Forever on the Path. And I believe that Charity Scott would have agreed with this. As we think about this movement to advance health equity, I want to talk about how we can continue not only to stay on the path, even though we're wobbling a little bit, but pave the way for the future of health equity and health justice. I thought I would also start with another great. a nationally recognized jurist, someone who has, again, also had a profound impact and influence on my journey. And I thought, how fitting is this quote from when he was receiving the Liberty Award in 1992, a little over 30 years ago, and how relevant is it still today as we begin to navigate the next 4 years. He says, "We cannot play ostrich. Democracy just cannot flourish amid fear. Liberty cannot bloom amid hate. Justice cannot take root amid rage. America must get to work. In the chill climate in which we live, we must go against the prevailing wind. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent from a nation that has buried its head in the sand, waiting in vain for the needs of its poor, its elderly, and its sick to disappear and just blow away. We must dissent from a government that has left its young without jobs, education, or hope. We must dissent from the poverty of vision and the absence of moral leadership. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better. How true is that today, right? Let's talk about it in the context of healthcare. Still today, you heard him talk about folks who have been marginalized, who have been vulnerable, under-resourced in our society, and yet we still see too many people, racial and ethnic minorities, older adults, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable population groups that have found themselves in a precarious situation. Their health, their lives have literally been hanging in the balance, so to speak, many of them falling through the cracks of our healthcare system, our public health system, our educational systems, employment systems, housing, behavioral health, you name it. Well, I thought I would start with why I'm extremely concerned and why the situation seems more precarious to me as we move ahead into the future. The U.S. over the last several years, last 2 decades in fact, has lost 2 decades of progress in life expectancy. A lot of this, of course, owing to the COVID pandemic, but again, for other reasons. What we have found lately in the research is that the United States has lagged behind comparable nations in improving life expectancy, experiencing smaller gains over time, steeper declines during crises, and a notably slower pace of recovery compared to its peers. Here are our rankings. In 2016, we ranked 34th in the world for life expectancy. By 2019, we had gone down to 43rd in the world for life expectancy. In fact, there was a global health study that was published, a landmark study published in The Lancet right before COVID was about to strike, showing that the United States was expected to fall 21 places in the world for life expectancy. Think about that, to 64th in the world. In 2021, owing to the mess of COVID, we dropped to 60th in the world. Now we've creeped up to 49th this year, but we still are expecting a huge decline, and it's even more rapid than what they were expecting back in 2019. Now, let's talk about the U.S. rankings in terms of healthy life expectancy. So these are your years free of chronic diseases and burden, right? So our healthy life expectancy is going to drop from 80th in 2022, and it was projected to drop to 108th by 2050. When you look at it in terms of sex, before the men get all excited, we know that women's life expectancy U.S. is forecast to drop to 74th by 2050 in the world, from 19th in 1990. Men are expected to decrease to 65th in the world, from 35th in 1990. When we disaggregate by race or ethnicity, you can see the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had in terms of U.S. life expectancy. All told, when you break it down by race or ethnicity, from the time that COVID struck until today, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians have lost 6.6 years on their lives. 4.2 years for Hispanic or Latinx Americans, 4 years for Black Americans, 2.4 years lost for white Americans, and 2.1 years lost for Asian Americans. The bottom line is that these are all very alarming statistics. I want to look at this across the United States. Across states, when you look at the number one state for life expectancy versus the last state in terms of life expectancy, there is a 7+ year difference. If you look at Minnesota versus West Virginia, they broke this down, both Mary and Montez broke this down into different age categories, from those before the age of 30, before the age of 50, and of course before the age of 65. What they found is that the state that has the highest life expectancy would realize 2 individuals dying before the age of 30, 5 would die before the age of 50 on average, and 13 would die before the age of 65. Compare that to West Virginia, where we're looking at 3 dying before the age of 30, 10 dying before the age of 50, and 24 dying before the age of 65. Now, I know we're in Georgia. Georgia ranks in the bottom 15 of these, right? So we're looking at about a little over 2 folks before the age of 30, 6.6, almost 7 individuals before the age of 50, and of course, almost 18 individuals before the age of 65. Let's go down a little bit more. When we really hone in on what's happening, when we compare it to the rest of the world, Georgia, if this state were its own country, would rank 90th out of 227 countries. When we look at the county in this state that has the lowest life expectancy in the early 60s, we're looking at 195 out of 227 countries. And here in our own backyard, Bankhead, ranking 211 out of 227 countries. We know that urban areas tend to have higher life expectancies than rural regions, owing, of course, to better access to healthcare. But you can see, even within urban settings, we have a problem. Now, I just want to let these statistics wash over you for a moment. Many of these statistics come from over 7,000 peer-reviewed journal articles that are published each year. In fact, we've seen over the last 5 years, on average, about 7,000. And I know this is owing to many of the scholars here at this college, at the university at large, and of course, colleagues around the country. You know, these under-resourced communities and individuals have struggled to live in a society that has intentionally erected barrier after barrier to weaken their bodies and hasten their deaths, leading to the striking inequities that we see in health status, in healthcare, and beyond. Women spend 25 more years of their lives in debilitating health than men. Underdiagnosed, undertreated for cardiovascular disease, endometriosis, autism, ADHD, autoimmune conditions, and antimicrobial resistance. The inequities in women's health alone equates to 75 million years of life lost due to poor health or early death, and that's every single year. Addressing this issue would result in 3.9 billion women in the world getting an extra 7 healthy days a year, or an average of 500 days over their lifetimes. Think about that. When you think about infant mortality, a baby born to an African American mother is twice as likely to die before reaching their first birthday. Ageism, another underrated issue in health policy. But ageism in healthcare often manifests as dismissing their symptoms as simply part of aging, leading to the misdiagnosis or delayed treatment for serious conditions that we know they have been going through. And then, of course, there are a host of other disparities that we are tackling and inequities that we are tackling. Now let's talk about what are the costs. We certainly know from studies that close to 100,000 individuals are dying each year in our country owing to just racial and ethnic disparities alone. A group of scholars from Meharry School of Global Health, including at Deloitte, economists got together and we said, we want to understand where we're heading into the future. Tom Leviste at Tulane and Daryl Gaskin at Johns Hopkins and other had done some reports analyzing the cost of inequities in our society. In 2009, the Leviste-Gaskin study showed us that we were conservatively spending $300 billion on racial and ethnic disparities alone. This does not include disparities relative to sex or disability and gender and so forth. So $300 billion. They crunched the numbers again and looked at the data from 2018, found that that had increased to $451 billion. And we decided last year, the last 2 years, decided to look into what it was costing us in 2024, and could we project out, right, into the future to 2040, when this country would become a more racially pluralistic society. And this is what we found with Deloitte, that $477.5 billion had been spent in 2024 owing to disparities. We looked at over the next 6 years, so by 2030, now 5 years, we would be spending $1 trillion a year. And by 2040, that would ratchet up to about $1.3 trillion. When you compound the cost, we're talking $14 trillion here in the United States. Now, it's been very fascinating to me as we've gone around advocating for policies, more egalitarian, equity-focused policies. And during my time in Congress, I had folks saying, well, that's not us in Georgia. That's those folks in California, in New Mexico, in New York. They're the reason why we have these high costs of racial and ethnic disparities. But here's what the research of late has shown. Georgia is, in fact, in the top 5 states. Texas, California, Illinois, Florida, and Georgia actually bear the greatest burden of health inequities in this country. Georgia at $21 billion. Think about that. This is why we cannot refuse and why we cannot ignore to address this issue in the state. I know many of us have seen the recent headlines highlighting the everyday impact of the political determinants of health, the effects of which, of course, can be observed in many areas of health and healthcare, including young children growing up without their mothers due to high maternal mortality, poor and minoritized families being funneled into substandard housing by inequitable systems, and of course people with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, drug and alcohol use disorder, ADHD, reporting over twice the odds of accessing transportation. I know many of us have seen over the last several years the struggle to advance health equity in America, and the levers of politics and policy and law that have been used at all levels and by all branches of our government, which have affected the health outcomes of every single population group in this country in one way or another. Let me be really clear. Health inequities are the unfair and avoidable differences in health status that arise from the social conditions in which people are born into, they live in, they play in, and they age in. And of course, this is caused by no fault of their own. These differences are not merely about genetics or individual choices. They are deeply rooted in social structures and policies. Health equity seeks to address these challenges by ensuring that everyone has a fair shot to be as healthy as they possibly can be. And fundamental to this work is the core truth that these differences can be reduced or eliminated by taking proper actions and investments. And I think that's the distinction that the political determinants of health makes. So, in our country, our community's health is not an organic outcome. It's not a coincidence that certain groups in our community experience higher premature death rates than others. It wasn't a fluke that some groups experienced poverty for generations, blocked from achieving the American dream. Our system has not always valued each group equally or realized the long-term implications of policies and laws that they have on the health of our population groups. Well, why is this happening? Well, today we recognize that there are a variety of factors, forces, that collectively impact our health, the quality of our lives, and of course the extent of our lives on this earth. And they include the social determinants of health, environmental, economic, behavioral, healthcare, and genetic factors. And yes, key among them, as we have learned in public health literature and research, are the social determinants of health, these structural conditions in which all of us are born into, we live in, and we eventually die in. Now, of course, they do play an outsized role in these human-made pre-existing inequities. But underlying each one of these social determinants of health, whether it's a transportation issue, a housing issue, an educational issue, are policy decisions, right, that were enacted years ago and still today that have affected these structural conditions. Well, too often, we've been stopping at the social drivers of inequities, failing to dig just a little bit deeper, right, to understand the problem, its root causes, its distribution, and as a result, we've been missing the link between the social determinants of health and their legal and policy roots. You see, for every social determinant of health, there was, in fact, a preceding ordinance, statute, case law, that actually resulted in the structural conditions in which members of our community find themselves in. So how did we get here? How did we get to these striking inequities in health status and healthcare? How is it that inequality gets under our skins, leading to accelerated aging or biological weathering, as Dr. Arlene Geronimus at the University of Michigan has studied? Or how has it led to the earlier onset of chronic diseases in our bodies, as Dr. David Williams and Lisa Cooper have studied? We all know that the impact of slavery has been associated with contemporary mortality, poverty, heart disease, intergenerational trauma, infant and maternal mortality. And so as we think about the structural conditions, we need to think about how they came to be in the first place. Well, I want to take a look at big P policy, little p policy today, both governmental and non-governmental policy. And I do want to take us back 400 years. I do believe 1619 is a fair starting point, but I'm going to start at 1641. And I start there because this was the period in time when the commercial interests, realizing that the abolitionists were gaining headway in their movement to abolish slavery, said, wait a second, we better do something real fast to legalize this institution, or else our business is going to be... Well, the commercial interests got together with the policymakers. They started first in Massachusetts, and they developed the bodies of liberty law. They used that as a template, used it throughout Connecticut, New York, Maryland. And if that weren't enough, they decided later on, once the abolitionists were also arguing that, well, we don't believe that law really intended to include the offspring of these black enslaved folks, they then went about amending the body of liberties law to include the offspring, to ensure that for purposes of the law, that these black infants would therefore be deemed slaves for generations to come. In addition to that, we also know that in the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s, there was an effort to create additional policies, laws that made it very difficult, that prohibited black and indigenous groups from being able to raise their own food. We know that food security is a critical social determinant of health. There were also laws that were developed prohibiting black and indigenous groups from being able to earn their own money. We know employment is a critical social determinant. They were also prohibited by law from being educated, from learning to read and write, especially English. Again, we know education is a critical social determinant of our health. Well, we also know that into the late 1600s and 1700s, additional laws were developed, making it very difficult for these folks to be able to move beyond a certain mile radius, depending on the jurisdiction. We know that movement is key to life and has some significant health implications. So after that, we could see how policies were recycled from one generation to the next, from the 1600s into 1700s into the 1800s, when Jim Crow reared its ugly head with a vengeance. And we saw the proliferation of laws and policies, again designed to stifle certain groups from being able to reach their full potential, their full health potential, in fact. Through epigenetic research, we can see how intergenerational trauma has occurred owing again to these structures that were developed. We can see direct link to aggressive breast cancer prevalence among African American women who have triple negative breast cancer, the most deadly form of breast cancer in this country. Now, after that, we then saw a movement away from these explicitly racist policies to these what we call facially neutral policies in the early 1900s. And here again, civil rights champions said, wait a second, these laws, these policies that have been designed are unconstitutional. They violate our Equal Protection Clause. How can you have a law that basically is harming certain groups of folks? Well, this time the Supreme Court could no longer continue to keep its head in the sand and instead had to address the issue. What we have seen, and this is very interesting to me, is racists are very clever people. And they developed laws in such a way that they would have the same effect once they were implemented. So on their face, we're not discriminating against one group or another based on different protected classes, but we're going to design them in such a way that they have the same effect once they are implemented and enforced. We all know that the Social Security Act is one such law, right? And in that law, you had Dr. Perrin, who was a Surgeon General at the time. Many of you might recall in public health. He is the architect of the Tuskegee syphilis study and the Guatemalan prisoners experiment. Terrible, terrible person in public health, but designed the law with Congress so that agricultural and domestic workers would not be able to benefit from that social and economic policy. 78% of African Americans and various immigrant population groups were denied the opportunity to take part in Social Security. That was intentional by design. We also know other laws like the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act under Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, again, implemented in concert with state and local policymakers, was designed to negatively impact different immigrant population groups and African American communities. This was the law that essentially authorized property appraisers to go out into the communities, over 200 cities and the neighborhoods of those cities, and rate them from an A, B, C, or D category, and to align them with a certain color. Your green communities were your affluent white communities at the time. That was your A communities, rather. Your B communities were your middle-class white communities. Those were your blue communities. Your C communities were your quote-unquote undesirable immigrant communities, and these were at the time largely Asian American populations, German, Italian, Irish, Cuban, as well as Mexican and other Central American folks. And then lastly, your D communities were your red communities. These were quote-unquote your hazardous communities. And what's pretty interesting about that, it took an act of law to authorize this study. Once the study was done, the results were aggregated, sent back to Washington, which they then used that to deny home mortgage loans, FHA and VA loans to different communities, those primarily in the C and D categories. Well, we've also seen other instances of facially neutral policies that we know today have had a tremendous health impact and have decreased the life expectancy of different population groups in our country. The Highway Act that created the 41,000-mile interstate highway in this country. We know today through public health research that we see higher rates of asthma owing to the higher particulate matter, right, from pollution. We know that there are higher rates of diabetes. Study after study shows this when they are very close to these highways, these built environments. We also see that with the design of where to place factories and railroad tracks and so forth. And again, study after study shows the health consequences of those laws and policies. Well, to make a long story short, moving fast forward, today we can see the impact that those policies, as well as more current policies, have on various communities in the form of a poverty tax, where they pay higher payments for auto insurance, home mortgage loans, have lower property appraisals. We can see the effect that they've had in terms of creating these food, pharmacy, and hospital deserts, making it more difficult for these communities to access health-sustaining and health-protective resources that they desperately need. And today we're facing another existential threat, climate change and the impacts of this, right, that are displaying lower socioeconomic groups across the country. Where big P policy and little p policy worked in tandem in the beginning, we have seen how they have played back and forth. Many of the investments that were made by federal governments have helped, of course, as well as in state governments, but we can also see where decisions were made not to invest in these communities and how the little p policy folks, right, the commercial interests, actually worked in tandem to ensure that they would be starved, choked of the resources that they would need. We know that political determinants of health are evidenced in the data. Research from public health, medicine, law, you name it, has shown that high obesity rates, maternal mortality, infant mortality, gun violence, depression, opioid addiction, substance use disorders, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, HIV/AIDS, and many other health problems in our society can be firmly linked back to policy action or inaction. We know policy has been a driving force for many of these health inequities in our society, many of which you may have seen or experienced yourselves or seen in your community. but it can also serve as a driving force for actually elevating health equity in a community. Because I believe that only policy can fix what policy broke in the first place. So, permit me to go back one more time in history. And I want to go back because folks have said, Daniel, that's not fair. You started at 1641. We weren't even a constitutional republic then. That's not fair. I said, all right, fine. Let's start at 1789 when we first became a constitutional republic. So permit me to go back one more time to 1789. I think throughout our history, many of us have seen the constant struggle, a tug of war, if you will, between those advancing the political determinants of health inequities and those that have been trying to counter the negative effects of policies and laws by leveraging the political determinants of health. So I want to go back to 1789 very quickly because William Faulkner, the great Southern writer, once stated that the past is never dead. It's not even past, he argues. And how true is that as we've been going through this time? So back in 1789, there were a group of health equity champions, if you will, that got together. Mental health reformers, advocates for homeless populations, abolitionists, and others who really cared about those who were invisible in our society. And they said, you know what? We have got to get the federal government to provide, this new government of ours, to provide for the general welfare of its people, all its people. Well, as they strategized and they thought about it, they said, how do we do that? How should we proceed? And many said, you know what? We need a major policy influencer, somebody who is highly respected in this country to press the federal government to do right by the least among us. And as they thought, they came upon Benjamin Franklin. And they said, Benjamin Franklin, would you please lend your name to a petition calling for the federal government to stop the separation of children from their mothers, to stop the breakup of families, to abolish slavery, and in addition to that, provide health services to people who desperately need it, provide the necessities of life that we desperately need, food and clothing, educational opportunities for people all over this country. What we call the social determinants of health now. They were arguing for in 1789. And as Benjamin Franklin listened to their arguments, he says, you know what? Yes, I will lend my name to this. He was coming to the close of his life, and as a slave owner, he wanted to, of course, repair his past. And so he signed the petition. They sent it to Congress, to the Senate and the House. And if you think we're having a very contentious negotiation or debate over health equity, over diversity, equity, and inclusion in our country, it seems to me that it was equally, if not more contentious back then. Folks said, how dare you, Benjamin? How dare you leaders bring up this issue when you know that we're just getting started as a government? Now is not the time to bring up this issue, they argued. Isn't that a refrain we've even heard today? Now is not the time, after 230 plus years of being a constitutional republic. Well, the Senate said, we're not even going to dignify Benjamin Franklin's petition with an answer. They ignored it. But the House said, we can't let Benjamin and these folks get away with this. And so in bullet by bullet form, they went about making the argument for why the federal government could not get involved in addressing these needs of the least among us, providing the general welfare of folks. At that point, they basically made the confederalism argument that the states are closer to these people. They were punting their responsibilities. Therefore, they know what's in the best interest of these enslaved people, these people with disabilities and others. And so before Benjamin Franklin could respond, 3 weeks after getting the letter, he died. And that was the first time in our country's history that the light of health equity had dimmed for us in this movement from a policy standpoint. It would take 75 years later, under the administration of Abraham Lincoln, for us to get another chance to really push forth a policy that would address all the issues that they were trying to get addressed in 1789. This time, in 1863, they introduced the Freedmen's Bureau Act, the most comprehensive and reticulated health reform law that the country had seen, a law that was addressing what we now call the social determinants of health in such a comprehensive and reticulated manner. And it was fascinating to go back into the archives to read exactly what had been done to get that law over the finish line. During debate, they tried so hard, the radical Republicans as they were called, tried so hard to get this bill passed. But there was one issue that was holding it up for the 2 years as we were winding down the Civil War, held up that bill. It was the provision to provide health care services. They had argued for everything else those in 1789 had argued for in the bill. Access to food, clothing, education, employment, even security they were willing to give. But health care access was one that even some members of Lincoln's party could not muster the appetite to allow in the bill. And so in the spirit of compromise, President Lincoln says, enough is enough. Get this bill done, pass it, strike that provision if you have to, and get it to my desk so I can sign it into law. And they did that. They struck the healthcare provision, gets it to his desk, and he signs into law. But what happens 4 weeks later? Y'all know history? Anybody remember what happened in 1865? He was assassinated. That's right. President Lincoln was assassinated 4 weeks later. And his supporters, not wanting to squander the crisis, right, the opportunity the crisis presented, said, wait a second, upon reading the Freedmen's Bureau Act, we believe that it actually does authorize us to provide health services to newly freed black folks and poor whites who were displaced across the country, again, because of the Civil War. And so they went about establishing sanitariums, hospitals, clinics around the country, in the South and in the Midwest. They started recruiting physicians and nurses to come into the South and into the Midwest to provide healthcare services to poor whites and blacks. And it lasted for about 7 years. So 7 years they were getting, and in fact, the records show that about 500,000 African Americans benefited from the program, and countless whites, millions of whites, also benefited from the program. But as we have also seen over the last several years, hate never takes a break, and racism doesn't sleep in this country. And the forces of ill will, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called them, were unrelenting in their opposition, wanting to dismantle the Freedmen's Bureau. Finally, on the 7th anniversary, they succeeded in doing that. And that was the first time in U.S. history that now the most comprehensive health reform bill was dismantled. It would take us 150 years later for us, under the presidency of Obama, to unite folks, to bring a group of 300 organizations representing groups across our country to create a comprehensive and reticulated health reform law, the Affordable Care Act. Now, let me continue for the sake of time. Today, many of you who follow Thomas Piketty's work, he's a renowned health economist, and he has recently concluded in his research that inequality did not simply emerge from economic reality, from technological change, or the organization of production, nor from inherent disparities in individual talent, ability, or effort. Rather, he argues, inequality is determined through struggles that take place in the political sphere. This raises really an important point for me. If the resources and the advantages attained through the political sphere are not equally distributed among population groups, then it's not surprising that the health outcomes and premature deaths that we're witnessing across the country are not equally experienced among different populations. Recent research has also shown us that downstream interventions which focus on change at the individual level are more likely to increase health inequality than our upstream interventions which focus on social change or policy change. This is a fact that we found when the National Academy of Medicine had authorized my group to look into interventions over the last 20 years and to both in peer-reviewed journals, in gray literature, anything that was published on interventions that were designed to improve health outcomes. And we were looking to see if they had in fact eliminated or reduced disparities among population groups. We found that the majority of them had failed to utilize an equity lens. The majority of them that focused on just individual level or downstream level interventions actually did not improve health inequalities. but the interventions that were designed at the clinical level, right? So clinical approaches that were bridged to a structural level intervention, that's when we saw improvements in that community's health. Remarkable. So let me talk about where we go from here, how we can leverage the political determinants of health. I think we've been talking now, we've seen how the hierarchy of human value really has been evolving over time in our country, how they were concretized in our policies and our processes and programs for centuries in this country. But here's the really good news, because I don't want anybody leaving all depressed tonight. Oh my gosh. You talked about 75 years to get this bill, then it was dismantled, then it took 150 years to get the Affordable Care Act, and now that might be in jeopardy. It won't take us 300 years, I don't believe. Here's what I do believe. The fact is that when we have passed egalitarian laws in this country, equity-focused policies, we have witnessed the tremendous impact that they have had on the health spans and lifespans of every single one of our population groups in this country, whether you are white, Asian, Black, Latino, Native American, Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native. We have seen the health impacts. In fact, one study that was done showed that when the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote, we saw between 8 and 15% improvements in maternal health and women's health across the United States, depending on jurisdiction. Within a couple years of them having the right to vote, going out to vote, we saw the policies change in their favor. The Olmstead decision, right? For those of you who are disability rights folks, the Americans with Disability Act, and the Amendments Act that came afterwards. Studies have shown that those laws, those decisions have led to increasing health spans and lifespans among people with disabilities. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, let me go with Civil Rights Act first. The Civil Rights Act, Title VI of that law, has been shown to actually between 1966 and 2002, has shown that 38,600 Black infant deaths were prevented during that time, owing again to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act has been shown to, of course, reduce infant mortality among whites and blacks by 20%. The Voting Rights Act didn't just help African Americans, it helped white children, white babies across the South as well. So another argument that I've heard of late, folks have said, Daniel, it's not true. When you help one group, or if we push laws that are to help all groups, then it does have a negative impact on one group. The truth is that many of these egalitarian policies have been proven by research so far to have demonstrated a positive impact for all population groups. So I don't subscribe to the zero-sum game. That to me is a huge myth, and you can see that from the evidence. Now, let me move us forward. What are the political determinants of health? I have defined them as involving the systematic process of structuring relationships, distributing resources, and administering power. And they operate simultaneously in ways that mutually reinforce or influence one another to shape opportunities that will either advance or hinder health equity. Now, let me break this down just a little bit more. When you look at this tripartite definition, whenever I'm analyzing a health outcome, I'm working with community members, whether it's an inequity or not, I think about how they came to be in the first place. What was the policy that created it or has been perpetuating or exacerbating it over time? How did the policy, that law or inaction, structure relationships in the community? How have health protective and health sustaining resources been distributed over time in that community? And how has power been administered in a community over time? Once that analysis is done, I then create an action plan based on the political determinants of health framework. So you get a sense of how we do our analysis of the School of Global Health when we are helping a community think about how to piece and go further and connect the individual level outcomes that they're experiencing to the social determinants of health, to ultimately those laws and policies that gave rise to the structural conditions. Many of those are dictated by policy tools and tricks. We've seen this time and time again, right? Unnecessary complexity, preemption, privatization, resource allocation or grant distributions, qualified or sovereign immunity. We know TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, is a great example for unnecessary complexity. And what we have seen in the research today through health policy research is that there's a decline, right, in enrollment because folks find that system so complicated. The implementation, the enforcement is just unbearable for many folks. We've seen preemption play out with Flint, Michigan, right, between the state and the city, between Mason County and the state. If you're familiar with Mason County, Tennessee, we've seen that again being used to usurp the taxing power of many of these local communities so that they themselves are left disadvantaged. We've also seen resource allocation grant distributions. I've worked with Jackson, Mississippi on the water crisis. And it was so heartbreaking to see the state of Mississippi refusing to send infrastructure funds that were being given to the state and were allocated for Jackson, going to other communities. We see that in Delta, Mississippi. And the list goes on. So here's my best attempt at looking at the evidence from a legal, political science, public health, and historical lens. The levers that have been pushed and pulled over time to effect changes. And the idea here, according to National Academies of Medicine, is that mortality is affected by factors at the macrostructural level. So these are your federal and state policies and corporate policies. The meso level, the workplace, and the individual or proximal level, those health behaviors and socioeconomic circumstances. Now, because I only have 5 minutes left, let me just quickly talk about how we have used this and how we leverage this to get the Affordable Care Act passed and to get ensuing policies passed. The idea here is that once a perceived health inequity is identified, you have to really conduct your due diligence to ascertain whether the health outcome is systemic, avoidable, or unjust, as Paula Braveman at the University of California, San Francisco has urged us. How far can you venture to understand whether it's an institutional or a structural barrier that created the issue? And what is the law or policy that is desired that you can demonstrate, right, to the government a value of investing in change? So in our country, advocates have to understand the disquieting truth that the political determinants of health inequities have rarely been addressed unless their reduction or elimination served other purposes. What do I mean by that? The success of any advocacy effort in our country to advance health equity, laws, and policies have depended on how palatable they have been to the commercial interests and whether we can show an investment value to the government. Case in point, as we were working on the Affordable Care Act and we were pushing our health equity agenda in the Affordable Care Act bills and white papers that were being circulated, the folks said we need to take a lesson. We were making the moral argument. 100,000 people are dying each year, and you could say that till your tongue bled, and nobody really cared. But we took a page from the playbook of mental health reformers, who after 100 years of trying, right? After Dorothea Dix came so close championing mental health reform, they finally recognized that they had to make an economic and national security argument. So after the Civil War, World War I, World War II, when the country was on its knees from a mental health crisis, the mental health reformers worked with the admirals and the generals, worked with the business interests, and they made the case for why the country should invest resources into mental health programs in this country. What they did was they demonstrated that 20% of young people at that time in the 1940s were unfit to serve in the military. 40% of people who ended up in the military ended up leaving prematurely before their time, and 60% of the hospital beds were being occupied by people with PTSD and other mental illnesses. Finally, the federal government could appreciate on the hierarchy of value that we place on chronic diseases that mental illness was on par, right? Was just as important as all of these physical health conditions that we have invested heavily in. So taking that lesson, when we were pushing for a health equity agenda in the Affordable Care Act, we worked with retired admirals and generals, as well as different corporate interests, to conduct different economic studies. And what we found was that now in 2009, at the time, 75% of young people were unfit to serve in the military. 75%, owing to higher rates of criminalization records, obesity, mental illness, and a host of other issues that we're still struggling with. The government could no longer ignore the truth that we had to invest, because as the nation becomes more racially diverse, and if the majority of these young people are coming from communities that are sicker and dying younger, it presents all sorts of economic and national security challenges for the country. That's how we got the Obama administration and the health reform champions in Congress to support this agenda moving forward. Some essential PDOH questions for how we can move forward. Again, I don't have time, but you'll get the slides, I'm sure. Think about them in terms of what policy and policies create or mitigate the risk leading to the effects, positive or negative, that we see today. Could the context be influenced by government? You know, we need to look at the processes, the rules, the norms, or other governmental practices to understand, you know, whether or not they are impeding our ability to push. And of course, looking at advocacy, voting, understanding the role of commercial interests in this effort, and of course, some intersecting issues there. So where do we go from here? Today, I believe that we are in the fourth awakening for health equity in the United States. You heard me start with Abraham Lincoln. That was the first time in our country that we got the most comprehensive bill focused on these structural level issues that were impacting poor whites and, of course, newly freed black people. After that awakening happened for us, that success, there was a backlash, or period of retrenchment and regression, right, that happened that lasted for almost 100 years, that brought us into the civil rights movement. And 2 years into the civil rights movement, this is when health equity champions woke up and said, you know what, Dr. King is right. Of all of the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. We have got to do something about it. And so they went about working on, of course, on various laws to desegregate our hospitals, of course, owing to Medicare, Medicaid legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, you name it. Laws that were designed to address the overt forms of discrimination in our society. We went through that. There was another backlash period, but that opened up another opportunity where folks said, my goodness, we spent all this time and we worked and succeeded in getting these egalitarian policies to address the overt forms of discrimination, but yet we see these subtle forms of discrimination still in our society that are causing these striking inequities in health status, in healthcare, and beyond. Why is that? They went about working on policy again, and because of those investments, it led to the incredible research in healthcare disparities that we were then able to use to design equity-focused policies moving forward. We've now had another backlash, but I believe that we are in a current situation where we're able to harness the powerful levers of multiple sectors. It may not feel like that right now with this federal government, but with state governments, with corporate partners, with academic partners and others, with folks globally. There is a deep understanding that there are inequities in our society. We've got to do something about it. And so that is what gives me hope, this fourth period that will open up to us so that we can push the agenda. I started with Thurgood Marshall. I want to end with him and another dear friend and mentor. He says, the measure of a country's greatness is its ability to retain compassion in time of crisis. As jurists, as those committed to the rule of law, as those committed to ensuring that we advocate for the rights of the least among us, I think it's worth remembering that our North Star should always be about caring for these communities. Dr. David Satcher, that mentor that I told you about, who served as our 16th Surgeon General, who grew up in Anniston, Alabama, in one of the most racist times in history, segregated times, he said, Daniel, what we need now more than ever are leaders who care enough, know enough, have the courage to do enough, and who will persevere until the job is done. I hope that you heard me loud and clear. This movement to advance health equity is not for the faint of heart, right? It does take tremendous courage. But first, we have to care about each and every community in our country. But as we've also heard, caring is simply not enough by itself. We also have to avail ourselves of the knowledge Take our heads out of the sand. Stop pretending that health is not political in this country, because it is. The laws impact every aspect of our practice, every aspect of our life. We need to connect the dots for our communities and ensure that the laws are aligned with our principles, our values, as Paul Wellstone, Senator Wellstone from Minnesota, had declared years before he passed. I want to thank you all again for the privilege of your time. Thank you for the honor of serving as the inaugural speaker. And if we have time, maybe we can entertain a question or two. Is that okay, Professor Wolf? Awesome. Thank you.
Good evening. I just want to congratulate Professor Wolf and the Health Law Center on this amazing inaugural event in honor of our dear colleague, Charity Scott. And thank you for this brilliant and timely presentation that appropriately quoted the Black National Anthem on the eve of what may be the last Black History Month.
Right.
This is so personal for me. I gave birth to my youngest son at 45. And during delivery, both of our hearts stopped.
Oh my God.
So we flatlined. And people came running and, they were like, she's a professor, blah, blah, blah. And so as I think about the mischaracterization of DEI and the targeting of data that reflects racial disparities, I'm wondering, how do we prevent things that are adverse to particular communities, like higher rates of maternal death during pregnancy and birth? How do we even address them if we aren't allowed to collect the data to document their existence?
Oh, I love that question. So there was a time when we weren't allowed to collect that data either, and yet we had a group of folks who collected the data as best as they could anyway. And I'm speaking of David Satcher, Louis Sullivan, and a few others who in the 1970s, early 1970s, when the Congressional Black Caucus was forming, they went to Louis Stokes and said, Congressman Stokes, you all have all these task forces on education, on jobs, on transportation, on crime, but yet you don't have anything on health. We need to have something on health. Look at what's going on in our communities. And the congressman was sympathetic. And he says, I've seen it too, but we didn't have any articles or anything that we could pull from, justifying the creation of a task force. Well, they decided, based on what they heard from Satcher and Sullivan and others, let's create that task force, which became a health brain trust, right? The Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust. And even though there were no NIH dollars, CDC dollars, or whatnot, they did their best to collect that data. I would implore us to follow suit, right? Because I also find it fascinating, back in 1979, Congressman Stokes, along with Senator Ted Kennedy, held the first hearing. Again, they didn't have much data, just the little studies that had been done, but they were able to get Ted Kennedy, convince him that he needed to hold a hearing on this. And so little by little, whatever we could pull, whatever they could salvage, that's what they used to keep the agenda moving forward. Thank God we had leaders who did that. And I think that even if all of these websites go down, they start scraping the data, we need to continue to do that to the best of our ability, even if it's not funded by NIH. But there are now foundations that give me hope. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Kellogg, Kresge, and others that are committed, right, to making sure that they protect as much of the research as possible. And they are committed to the kind of research that we are engaged in, right, around data collection and reporting, the disaggregation of data. They want to make sure that we do that. And maternal mortality, we know, is a crisis in this country. You can rest assured that there are private foundations who will put their money where their mouth is to ensure that scholars like you, right, those with lived experiences too, can have the resources to ensure that we have what it needs to hold us until we get to an opportunity where we can, of course, seat a government that will be sensitive to the agenda. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Yes.
First, I would want to echo what you said. Please, I think we owe Leslie and Stacy and Charity's family here a round of applause for making this really wonderful event happen. And we will be thanking you with a round of applause shortly as well, because this was absolutely fantastic and very, very interesting. One thing you said that really struck me that I wanted to get your take on was connecting in, rather than focusing on individual actions, but looking more at connecting it to a structural impact. Mm-hmm. I think that's particularly interesting for a law school, where a lot of times we take on cases with individual clients. And I was just wondering if you could help tie that together, especially for the students, of how working on cases with individual clients like we do in our excellent clinics here can tie or should tie back to some of those structural changes that you've been researching and presented for us.
So that's another great question. And for me, it's an and, not an or, right? We have to work on that individual level, but it cannot be solely at the individual level. I think as we're working to meet the needs of our clients at that local level, let's say it's a housing issue, for instance, I would hope that the students here are also working on policies to rectify maybe some of the issues that they're dealing, right, in that particular case. So that's one way of bridging the divide, I think, to that structural level, especially as law students here at this school, at this college. Anyway, and of course there are a host of fellowship opportunities I want to encourage folks to look at. We talked about them last night and with the students earlier today that I got to meet. I'm happy to discuss some of those if you're interested as well, but another great opportunity for folks. Thank you.
I think we can all agree this was a phenomenal start to this series. We know that we will, continue in this, but thank you for starting us off in such a way and for leaving us with hope, right? It's been a rough couple of weeks for those who are committed to health equity, as we have been in our program from the beginning. So thank you for giving us that, for reminding us. I look at Sylvia, we've had a health legislation and advocacy class that she did that we have continued with Megan Douglas and Jenna Jolison, who are our graduates, who are, so again, looking at ways that we can all work together to do the good work. I'm reminded my work is in ethics. We always have to ask the questions that are right questions to ask. So to the question, let's keep, collecting the data. We have to, and there are ways to do it, as you say, and thank you for providing that. Thank you all for coming, for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at other events in the future. Have a good night.